Madison Square Garden. After all these years, still the world's most famous arena. Mainly because all the others keep changing their name. Looking at you, Crypto Arena. This video isn't about MSG though. It's about the theatre underneath it. Formerly known as Felt Forum and the Paramount Theatre, it's hosted legendary boxers, comedians, and yes, the Wiggles. But more importantly, it's hosted a fair bit of wrestling over the years too. On March 11th, 2025, NXT Roadblock was presented from the venue under the world's most famous arena, and it would mark the first time a full WWE broadcast had aired from there. Did you know though, that WWE had run a match in the venue once before? And did you also know that other promotions have run it too? Before we get into the video, just a brief disclaimer. Some of the stories in this aren't going to be the most groundbreaking, but I did find something to talk about from every show I could find from the theatre at MSG. In this video, we'll look at every wrestling show that ever occurred in the theatre at Madison Square Garden. We'll look at the circumstances around each event, and what happened on each night. Before I get into actual shows held at the venue, it's worth noting that wrestling fans would fill the Felt Forum back in the 1970s and 80s, as fans who couldn't get into the WWF cards at the Garden could watch in there on closed circuit. Felt Forum's capacity for this was around 5,000, meaning that MSG's attendance was technically even higher than often reported. This video is more concerned with actual events that took place in there, but it's still worth noting. The first time a live wrestling show took place in the venue was in the Paramount Theatre days, and it might not be who you would expect. On April 14th, 1993, WCW would run the Paramount Theatre. This might well have been the first time a live wrestling card was presented in the MSG Theatre, and it was also WCW's first ever event in New York City, the home base of their biggest rival. In 1989, still under the NWA banner, the company would run house shows in Rochester, Troy, Syracuse and Buffalo. The first time they televised an event from the state was Clash of the Champions 9 New York Knockout in Troy later that year. Until April 1993, the closest they'd come to Madison Square Garden was the Meadowlands, then known as the Brendan Byrne Arena, just a few miles away in East Rutherford, New Jersey. At the time, the Wrestling Observer newsletter reported that the show was considered a complete disaster by both fans in attendance and by staff behind the scenes. Firstly, Ric Flair, who had been scheduled to make a non-wrestling appearance, was not at the show, as the plane he was flying in on from Charlotte had engine problems. This resulted in chants throughout the night of "We want Flair," but WCW was unable to do anything about this. Dave even notes that the show was compared negatively to that year's recent WrestleMania 9, and that's saying something. In another interesting note from the week before's issue, Rick Rude had appeared on Howard Stern on April 9th to try and promote the event. I say try, as Rick barely got a word in, as Stern cracked jokes at Fred the Elephant Boy. The Observer also noted that WCW had far from sold out the venue, drawing 2,900 paid, just over half of what the venue could hold. In the following week's issue though, this number was corrected to just 2,300, moving it to less than half. As far as the card, reports were that the best match of the night, or at least the most promising one, was Ron Simmons vs Chris Benoit, but this was stopped abruptly a minute in, for which nobody knew the exact reason. In the main event, Sting defeated WCW World Champion Vader by DQ when his manager Harley Race interfered. This only added to the feeling of being ripped off by the high ticket prices. $25, $19 and $11. Bloody hell, try getting into a WWE show for that now. WCW would return to the Paramount Theatre a few years later, right before one of the biggest moments in their history, but we'll get back to that soon. The next show at the venue might be a surprising one though. On July 27th, 1994, AAA of all companies ran the Paramount Theatre. Not only did they outsell WCW the year earlier, but they did so by hundreds of fans, with 2,800 paid reported initially. Dave notes in The Observer that the number may have ended up higher than this, with more fans piling in throughout the night to make the place feel like a sellout by the end. The event was part of a 2-show tour, with AAA also running the Rosemont Horizon in Chicago the night before. While both shows were money losers for the promotion, the tickets were priced between $25 and $50, which made for an impressive looking gate figure of an estimated $99,000. As early as May, Dave Meltzer had referred to the events, which were promoted as AAA IWC shows, as a gamble. He says, "While both New York and Chicago have large Spanish-speaking populations, this is the first time AAA IWC will have attempted shows outside the Southwest, and in markets where there is no past history of successful Lucha Libre style shows." AAA had run California a fair bit, but as David said the week earlier, venturing outside of California for Lucha Libre is definitely a major dice roll. While many AAA stars that US fans would come to know in later years were on the card, such as Conan, Psychosis and La Parka, there were a fair few Americans too. Diamond Dallas Page and Too Cold Scorpio were on both nights, and in the main event, Jake Roberts teamed with Eddie Guerrero and Art Barr. While Jake had wrestled for AAA a few times in the year earlier, in California and Mexico, this would be DDP's only matches for the promotion. Going into the show, it was also announced that Pedro Morales would be honoured on the night, and he would be just before the main event. The Puerto Rican-born Morales had been the WWF champion from 1971 to 73, and had sold out Madison Square Garden throughout that time. According to a report from the show printed in The Observer though, it seemed like many of the fans in attendance didn't seem to know who Morales was. Some 21 years after he lost the championship, and 7 years after his last match. The next show to take place from the Paramount Theatre would be a WCW event on June 30th, 1996. This time with a familiar face to New York fans on the card. No, not Hulk Hogan, but more on him in a minute. The semi-main event on the night was Randy Savage vs Ric Flair. A very clever main event to put on, given that the two had faced off at WrestleMania 8 a few years earlier, and were very familiar to WWE fans. The match would be refereed by Bruno Sammartino, famed seller-outer of Madison Square Garden. Pedro Morales, who I mentioned earlier, also appeared, accompanying Conan to the ring. Overall, the show could be considered a far greater success than the last, as 3,500 paid were reportedly there, according to the New York State Athletic Commission, much improved over last time. Reports that came into The Observer after the event were generally positive, however one wrestler on the card didn't receive too warm a welcome. United States champion Conan would defend his title against Kevin Sullivan, but would be heckled throughout the match by the crowd, who were chanting things such as "You still suck," ECW, and "Sandman kicked your ass." These chants are referring to Conan's brief time in ECW in late 95 and early 96, where on his first and last nights in the promotion, he would lose to the Sandman for the ECW World title. This poor reception would cause Conan to go on a profanity-laden rant. Conan, after swearing at the fans, which drew him a lot of heat among WCW officials, said that ECW was at a bingo hall, and WCW was where the big boys played, and they were drawing 5,000 people. Kevin Sullivan quickly got the mic away from him, and basically did an apology, saying that those weren't the opinions of WCW, and that WCW didn't feel that way, then said some politically very nice things about being a fan of ECW. At Bash at the Beach a week later, Conan would lose the US title to Ric Flair. Whether this was planned already, or a punishment for what happened, we might never know. I said before that I would get back to Hulk Hogan. Well, 1 week after this event would take place, Bash at the Beach 96 would happen, where he would do a John Cena, as I'm now calling it, and turn on the Hulkamaniacs, forming the New World Order. Neither Hall, Nash, or Hogan were on the show, but who knew that a week later, the three would make history. Remember that one WWE match that I hinted at in the intro? It happened at SummerSlam 1998, on August 30th. While the rest of the card, headlined by Stone Cold Steve Austin defending the WWF title against The Undertaker, took place in the main MSG arena. One match did take place in the theatre. Halfway through the night, Ken Shamrock would do battle with his rival Owen Hart in a brand new kind of match, as they would step into the Lion's Den. At Fully Loaded a month earlier, the two had a fight in the infamous Hart family dungeon, where Owen would cheat to win by using a dumbbell as a weapon. For the rematch, they would battle in a cage that was more suited to Shamrock, clearly inspired heavily by the UFC octagon. In an interview with James Romero in 2022, Ken Shamrock said that he had input in the design of the cage, including the slanted walls, which according to him allowed he and his opponents to work with them similar to ring ropes. In later versions of the match, weapons were hung from the top of it, and Ken says that was also his idea. One other thing Shamrock adds is that the walkway along the top was thought of as something for a wrestler to jump off, though this would never happen in any of the Lion's Den matches. In the August 10th Observer, Dave would lay out the tentative plans for the match. They've booked the 4,500 seat theatre in Madison Square Garden, formerly known as the Paramount Theatre, and before that the Felt Forum, and will set up a fighting structure similar to a UFC octagon. And the Shamrock Hart match will take place there, with all tickets $18, and they'll probably also do a live angle in that building, and they'll air the rest of the show on closed circuit from next door. In another interesting part, Dave notes that WWF asked UFC for the use of the octagon for the match, but even though UFC and WWF have been on good terms, UFC felt it would be compromising the product if the octagon structure was used in a worked match. Perhaps the reason that WWE hasn't attempted anything quite like this since lies in the numbers from that night, as 15,000 paying fans were reportedly in the main arena, while the theatre didn't do so well. While with the Lion's Den cage in there, the venue was set up for 4,500 fans, and only 2,500 attended, of which 1,800 had bought tickets. While WWE wasn't likely hurting for money following the night, thanks to its high ticket sales in the arena, 200 grand in merchandise sales, and 700,000 buys on pay-per-view. As the Observer notes, considering the hype for the show and the state of the business, that theatre figure just exemplifies, even more so than the Nitro attempt in Philadelphia some months back, that closed circuit is dead. Despite the UFC aesthetic, Hart and Shamrock would have a very pro-wrestling feeling match in the MMA setting. I don't know what they used for the flooring of the cage, but the bumps taken in the match sound pretty gnarly, and Shamrock said in that interview I mentioned earlier that it had absolutely no give, unlike a pro wrestling match. Former UFC heavyweight champion Dan Severn would refuse to throw in the towel for Owen Hart, allowing Shamrock the win, which would lead to a submission match between Severn and Hart in the following month. The Lion's Den would return a few more times, often lurking in the corner of the arena, much like mud pits, graves, hog pens and other gimmicks had for other matches, and it wouldn't be seen again after Ken Shamrock left the WWE a year later. Now that WWE and UFC are both under the same corporate overlords, who knows if the Lion's Den could someday make a comeback? I do. It's not likely. For the next show, we jump 18 years ahead. On November 16th, 2016, NXT Black and Gold, the name retroactively given to the super indie days of the brand, presented a live event from the theatre at MSG, which was reported to have had 3,000 fans in attendance. That number sounds massive for what is a developmental brand, but NXT was becoming very strong at this time, even touring internationally and holding WWE Network specials outside of their regular home at Full Sail University. I did say at the start of this video that some of these stories weren't exactly going to be revelations. Well, the most newsworthy thing that was reported about this NXT event were some special guests in the crowd. Shane McMahon, his kids, and former member of the Mean Street Posse, Pete Gas, were all in attendance. And they would even take part a little bit, dancing with No Way Jose following his win over Roderick Strong. That's right, No Way Jose was a thing, and he beat a former Ring of Honor World Champion. Later in the night, it would also be noted that Johnny Gargano would dive out of the ring, nearly landing in Shane's lap. Well, that's one way to get noticed, but it might not get you onto the main roster. The show was headlined by a 6-man tag team match, in which NXT champion Shinsuke Nakamura and DIY would defeat Samoa Joe and the NXT tag team champions The Revival. now known as FTR. Shinsuke would pin Dash Wilder after hitting a Kinshasa just a few days before NXT TakeOver Toronto, where Samoa Joe would defeat him for the NXT title. Joe and Nakamura had been trading the championship back and forth for much of the year, and would continue into 2017. Shinsuke had originally won it from Joe at TakeOver Brooklyn 2 in August, but Joe would take it back in November in Toronto. Nakamura would win the title back in December in Osaka, Japan, and would end the feud by retaining it in a steel cage match in Melbourne, Australia 1 week later, though this would air in January 2017. Speaking of TakeOver Toronto, DIY would also win the NXT Tag Team Championships from the Revival. This match would rank number 1 in a top 25 list of WWE.com's top matches of 2016. These were truly interesting times for NXT, when they had a slew of guys they wanted to build themselves, mixing with top international indie talent. But also, I forgot how much of an absolute banger the theme song was. For the final entry in this video, AAA would return to the former Paramount Theatre 25 years after their first time there. This would be the only show on this list to take place during the brief time that it was known as the Hulu Theatre, though it was originally supposed to take place inside Madison Square Garden itself. The story of this is long and complicated in itself, as AAA had been trying to get an event in the Garden since the year earlier. WWE had long had a stranglehold on running Madison Square Garden, but in June 2018, Mike Johnson of PW Insider reported that the Garden had been reaching out to other wrestling companies, as WWE had not been running in the venue consistently, choosing instead to run the Barclays Center in Brooklyn. WWE is running all of their WrestleMania 35 week events in Barclays, which has been in a promotional war with MSG over touring acts since the Brooklyn venue opened in 2012. This may well have led to Ring of Honor and New Japan being able to run the Garden in April 2019. In the August 26th Observer, Dave reports that the show was officially moved to the Hulu Theatre, citing low ticket sales and very poor advertising. PW Insider reported that the decision was made quietly 2 weeks earlier, after AAA executives met with the Garden executives. Dave adds that at this point they had 2,000 tickets sold, so these could likely be transferred into the smaller venue. Another problem that the show faced was the promotion not being able to get work visas in time, which Dave credited to the Trump administration. It's been hard for Japan, but because of Trump's presidency, it's 10 times worse for those from Mexico. We were told that visas used to take maybe a month, but there are some visas that have taken 8 months and they still haven't been approved. On September 15, 2019, Lucha Invades New York would take place, co-promoted with Impact Wrestling. The link with Impact came about only a couple of weeks before the event, as the September 9th Observer notes that AAA didn't have a license to promote in New York, but Impact did, as they've run there many times before. At that time, the only match announced that included Impact talent was Taya Valkyrie vs Tessa Blanchard, and possibly due to them coming to help out, more Impact names will be added to the show. Josh Alexander, Sami Callihan and Michael Elgin all represented Impact in a 6-man tag against AAA stars, while a couple of other matches would feature regulars for both promotions, as Taya Valkyrie would defeat Tessa Blanchard for the Reina de Reyes Championship, while the Lucha Brothers would defend the AAA World Tag Team titles against Santana and Ortiz, who were still LAX at the time. Looking at the card, even with the Impact wrestlers on it, one name noticeably stands out: former 2-time UFC heavyweight champion Cain Velasquez. I should probably warn you here that I'm not well versed in Lucha Libre, so apologies if I butcher any names here. Cain was taking part in his second professional match, his first being a month earlier at Triple Mania 27, a match that also had Cody Rhodes in it. On this night at the Hulu Theatre, he would team up with Brian Cage, who was an Impact talent at the time, to face El Texano Jr., Rey Escopion, and Taurus, now known as AEW's Beast Mortos. Not long after this event, Cain would sign what was reported by major outlets to be a multi-year deal with WWE, and later that month he would have his one and only televised match for the promotion, a 2-minute loss to his former UFC rival Brock Lesnar in Saudi Arabia. As of me making this video, This would be his one and only singles match of his pro wrestling career. He would wrestle one more match at the house show in Mexico City, before being released on April 28, 2020, as a cost-cutting measure during the pandemic, along with a slew of other wrestlers. Aside from all the issues I mentioned earlier, there were more woes for AAA after the show. Lucha Invades New York had been available as both iPay-per-view on Fight and on traditional pay-per-view, the numbers for the latter being terrible. In The Observer, Dave reported that in more than one market with a high percentage of Hispanics, there were 0 buys, as in not a low number, but 0. Based on actual numbers we have, it would indicate less than 60 buys nationwide. In the same newsletter, Dave noted that the show would air for free on Access TV, where Impact also aired. So that brings us to the present day, an NXT Roadblock. While the event had begun in 2016 as a WWE Network special on the road to WrestleMania, since 2022, the name had been used for a special televised episode of NXT. This year's iteration was first announced on February 11th, exactly 1 month before, and was booked into the theatre to tie in with Raw on the previous night, coming from the Garden. NXT has run some really interesting venues over the last year, like the former ECW Arena, and long may it continue, as it gives these shows a very special look and feel to them. WWE made the place look stunning, and it makes me wonder why they haven't run the venue more. As of the afternoon of the show, according to WrestleTix on X, they had distributed over 4,700 tickets, with just 58 remaining based on the setup they had. The venue was displaying a big sold-out sign outside, and as far as I can tell, NXT Roadblock may have been the first show to ever achieve this. If all the numbers that I've quoted through this video are accurate, this makes NXT Roadblock the most successful wrestling show to ever come from the theatre at Madison Square Garden, because you can bet they ramped those ticket prices up as well. That doesn't feel too unbelievable though, with WWE riding so high these days, breaking some kind of record seemingly everywhere they go. The card for Roadblock was absolutely stacked as well, with the Hardys defending their TNA Tag Team titles, as well as a match for the NXT Championship, and a title-for-title match between two of WWE's biggest acquisitions of last year, who seem to be on a collision course. NXT hasn't just outsold their own last effort in 2016, they've outsold every other wrestling show the venue has ever held, and I bet the LFG legends think they did it too, except Mickie James. She seems cool. Thank you for watching yet another wrestling channel. If you enjoyed this, please comment, like or subscribe.